The good stuff. Dedication. George Passmore, 1916 to 2000. My father taught me to sail. He taught himself to sail too. At the age of 14, he didn't know what the shrouds were for, so he tied them in a bundle at the bottom of the mast. The mast fell down. He owned a succession of boats after that, one of them Wanderer, he bought from Eric Hiscock, who went on to write the seminal Around the World in Wanderer 3. Years later, they met at the boat show. Father reminded him. "Ah, yes," said Hiscock. "Pig of a boat, wasn't she?" In these pages you will see just how much of an influence Father had on my sailing. It is time to say thank you. Epigraph. Grab a chance and you won't be sorry for the might have been. The words of Arthur Ransom, carved into the bulkhead of Wanderer 3 when Eric and Susan Hiscock set off on their circumnavigation in 1952. Introduction. I'm writing this in the North Atlantic, about a third of the way between Mindelo in the Cape Verde Islands and Grenada in the Caribbean. It is a typical trade wind crossing. The sun is shining, the breeze is dead astern at about 18 knots, and Samsara, under twin headsails, is looking after herself as she has for the past week, while reeling off 100 to 120 miles a day. With 1,487 still to go, it will take at least another 10 days, probably closer to 2 weeks. It is my first trade wind crossing, a rite of passage. I've been looking forward to this. I have been imagining this all my life. 28 years ago, I thought I was ready to go. I gave up my career as a newspaper correspondent and announced that I was going sailing. When I went into the Evening Standard office for the last time, 2 librarians came down to the editorial floor bearing armfuls of wire trays loaded with buff folders. These were the cause files, everything that this particular correspondent had written for any of the group's titles since he arrived as a keen young reporter doing his first night shift at the Daily Mail in 1976. In other words, 20 years' worth of work, near enough. My colleagues gathered around and picked over the archive. There were dispatches here from China and Czechoslovakia, from Berlin and Bogna. With a flourish, I emptied the whole lot into the wastepaper bin. Not wanted on voyage. The news editor, a great friend and mentor, began pulling them out, stacking them neatly again. "You can't throw this away. This is a lifetime's work. This is history." It was true. If I had been an outgoing Prime Minister, it would have been stored in environmentally controlled conditions at my old university college, available to historians as the Passmore Archive. But then I was not a Prime Minister and never went to university. I put them back in the bin. In the end, we compromised, and I kept 2 folders. These covered the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, including the drive I took with all the East Germans in their 2-stoked Trabies as they escaped down through Czechoslovakia and Austria into West Germany. There we plunged into the biggest party I have ever witnessed as people were reunited with parents and siblings and ex-spouses and, absurdly, had bananas pressed on them at every turn. The Wessis were convinced that the Ossis had never seen a banana. I have those 2 folders still, and the centre spread from Tiananmen Square. My children find them interesting sometimes. But there was another archive that did get preserved, virtually intact. Once I had my feet under the table at the Daily Mail, I bought a small boat, an 18-foot caprice called Amicus, and started reading magazines such as Yachting Monthly and Practical Boat Owner. Since I spent my working days writing for newspapers, it made sense in the evenings to submit the occasional piece to the magazines. They seemed to like what I sent them, and this became a regular thing. In particular, Andrew Bray, the editor of Yachting Monthly, was happy to print whatever I offered him, even my attempts at cartoons. After the first few years, I was being published so frequently that it seemed a good idea to file these as well, by tossing them into the bottom drawer and forgetting about them. They spent years in that bottom drawer, and then more years in Tamsin's parents' attic. My mother added to them, so did my sister, and the news desk assistant at the Evening Standard. Bit by bit, the excavated pages, the fading photocopies, and occasional complete publication grew into collections spanning, as far as I can make out, 1985 to 2003. That was when I moved ashore, and, as described in the Old Man's Sailing book, attempted to settle down and be content in a small market town, looking at boats while walking the dog along the river and trying to race a laser round the boys on a Saturday. Now that I am living aboard once more, it has all started up again. But instead of submitting hard copy in envelopes, or latterly trailing all around town trying to fix a fax machine, I have my own blog at the end of a data signal, and with it the wonderful sensation of being in direct contact with the readers. After all, they respond instantly, as if they're old friends, which I like to think they are. So it was on a whim, as blithely as I had thrown away the newspaper cuttings, that I rescued the sailing archive, scooping it up on a visit home before setting out for Weymouth. And then it spent 6 months stuffed into the bookcase between Caribbean passage making and the Atlantic Islands pilot. It was only after the first 500 miles of the crossing to the West Indies, realizing there really was very little to do but sit in the sun, that I cast around for something new to read. That was when I pulled out the folder from the bookcase. Immediately, all those pages spilled out all over the cabin. There was stuff in there I had forgotten all about. Pieces I had written for the Ocean Cruising Club's Flying Fish magazine, my award-winning entries in the rival Owners Association newsletter. There was Dogwatch, the column Andrew Bray gave me when he moved from Yachting Monthly to Yachting World. I remember him telling me I could write about anything I liked, as long as it had something to do with boats and would make people smile. Had any writer ever been given a broader brief? Dogwatch ran for a decade, every month from 1993 to 2003. A book all by itself. I wrote about everything you can imagine, and some things you might not. Dockside hosepipes, marina showers, knickers. At one point I enclosed a note with the monthly fax, asking if it wasn't all getting a bit absurd. Was this really what he wanted? Andrew sent back, "Keep it up, it's good stuff." Dogwatch only came to an end when I had been living in a house for 3 years and sat up late one night, leaning hard against the deadline, and typed into the blank computer screen, "I've had enough of this." You can find that dispatch on the last page of Book 2. But in case you don't have it yet, here is an extract. I've been doing this column since April 1993. That's more than 10 years. 130 columns and 100,000 words. It's a blockbuster novel. I have, in my time, discussed ensigns, toothache, and gangplanks. I have considered the merits of jet skis and found none. I extolled the virtues of a dressing gown aboard a boat and established the principles of navigation by smell. And where would we be without Passmore's Law of Lost Hats or my definitive guide to the yacht club showers of the United Kingdom? Then there was the dog. Remember the dog? Remember his ladder-climbing prowess and midnight leaps onto his bunk, somehow forgetting that someone else had borrowed it for the night? It's all here in what I call the Dog Watch column, a list of topics that I started keeping when I realized there was a very real danger of repeating myself. Mind you, there were occasions when I ignored the list and decided the story was too good to be limited to just one outing. Like 5 of us in a folk boat back in the 50s with my sister sleeping on the floor, and the way father would rise to check the warps at 0300 and step straight onto her face. There was bridgemanship and the herrings down the back of the cooker in Amsterdam. The party we had in the middle of the O-Star with half a dozen of us meeting up in the middle of the Atlantic on 4143.5 megahertz for champagne and canapes. And gracious me, did I really say that about the Woodbridge Harbour Master? How did I know that I was going to go back there and buy a house? Then there was the Daily Telegraph. Max Hastings had tried to recruit me from the Mail when he took over as editor in 1986. When I resigned in 1995, I went back to him and suggested a column. We agreed that I would write about a voyage around the United Kingdom coastline. He had enough about palm trees. It ended up as a personal journey into small-scale family life. The Mail's You magazine gave me space, and the local paper, the East Anglian Daily Times, and also for some reason I have never been able to explain, Australian Woman's Weekly. Spreading it out all over the rolling cabin as we surfed ever westwards, I sifted through accounts of the mother of all brooches off the Grand Banks, levitating the dog in Rye, getting marooned in the mud at Mersey Island. There was the original piece from the front page of the Telegraph's weekend section explaining that Tamsin and I were giving up everything to embark on a new and better life. The whole story of that life slid off my lap onto the cabin sole, unfolding month by month in delicate yellowing newsprint. Remember that walk across the blazing sands of St. Aubyn's Bay and deciding there was room on the boat for a baby? The search for lunch in Milford Haven, antenatal care above a sex shop in Amsterdam, putting down roots for a winter in a cottage ashore, and then the wrench in tearing them up and setting off again. And, of course, the final, awful discovery amongst the First World War cemeteries of Picardy, that if one baby on a small boat was hard work, 2 was a recipe for broken dreams. This wasn't just good stuff. This was mesmerizing. A life in snapshots following the undercurrents of the narrative unfolded a fortnight at a time. Some of it fills in the gaps in the Old Man Sailing book. Some of it seems to come from another life entirely. Not everything is included. For one thing, I didn't start collecting cuttings until 1985. And I have left out anything that didn't seem relevant to the story. The Law of Lost Hats is missing because that was included in the original book. And of course, the capsize of Lottie Warren and my rescue by helicopter was done to death, almost literally, and got a whole chapter to itself. The humour of Dogwatch is juxtaposed with the sometimes darker passages from the newspapers. The squalor, the arguments. The salt cellar is thrown across the cabin. A small boy forces himself between us. "Stop shouting! Stop shouting!" But was there any point in writing about any of it unless it was real? In putting it all together, I will admit to a weakness for tinkering with the copy until, as used to happen, the editor tears it out of the typewriter. So there has been much editing and complete rewrites for no better reason than I felt I could do better. Lacking any sense of shame, I have left in my own shortcomings and even corrected attempts to portray events in a better light than they deserved. As I said, I am not an outgoing Prime Minister. Chapter 1. The Black Box. Halfway between Guernsey and Les Adrieux, just by that ominous legend on the chart about magnetic anomalies, the gremlins got into the VHF. Well, it seemed more likely than the other explanation that Jersey Radio had left the set switched to 1 watt. But certainly, all they seemed able to offer was a long, if dignified, silence. This was broken by another plaintive call from a second confused yachtsman, also twiddling knobs and getting nowhere. So I called him up. "I can't raise them either," I complained. "I ought to be able to. I'm halfway between Guernsey and Les Adrieux. Where are you?" That was when the only other person in the world I could talk to told me this. "Where am I? Hold on a minute. I'm at 48 degrees 75.31 minutes north, 03 degrees 26.25 minutes west." The Decca navigator had struck again. The conversation progressed a little beyond that, and we established that he had just come out of Les Adrieux bound west, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to put it so simply. Like many of the new generation of button-pushing yachtsmen, he was entirely obsessed with the microchips. It was a bit like asking the time of someone with a digital watch and being told 15:49 instead of 10:04. I consoled myself with a beer and the knowledge that, according to my trusty Seafix, I was somewhere in a cocked hat 10 miles by 15 just west of the Banque de Langostière. What worried me more was where we were going in this pastime that is supposed to get us back to nature, at one with the universe and all that. What of the old seaman-like skills, gauging the leeway by squinting down the log line, adding a bit to the tidal stream at the end of a gale? What hope was there for an age when the black box on the bulkhead can tell you the difference between the two sides of the pencil line on the chart? I was beginning to sound depressingly like the old boy in the yacht club who greeted the appearance of the first depth recorder back in the 1950s with the question, "What happens when it goes wrong?" And then something very embarrassing happened. My colleague and occasional crew, the somewhat dangerous Woodgates, came up with the idea of racing. Racing would test us, he expounded in the pub after work. Racing would bring us glory, he insisted, pushing another pint of Braxpears into my hand. Against all wisdom and common sense, I entered us for the Yachting Monthly Triangle Race, described, as far as I remember, as reasonably testing for two-handed amateur crews. With a course centred in the western approaches, taking in Falmouth, Crosshaven and Morgat, I could see why they would say that. Never mind, Woodgates had a secret weapon. Unzipping his enormous sailing bag, covered in yachty logos, he produced from the mess of dank oilies and mismatched socks the very latest thing, a Decca navigator. With the same sort of expansive promises that had got me into the race, he had talked it out of the manufacturers. We could keep it for the whole summer, he said. It would win us the race, he said. But I wasn't going to let it run the ship. Oh, no. I regarded Largo, a Rival 32, as a proper ship, and proper ships, unlike the modern lightweight displacement rubbish, don't rely on microchips. So we set off from Poole, bound westwards for Falmouth. It was the same as always, an ingenious plan for catching the tide off the headlands and letting the east-going stream waste itself in the bays. A plan that promptly got blown apart by a healthy westerly sending us bashing out into the channel. By mid-afternoon, the little crosses on the dead reckoning were marching off somewhere in the direction of Ushant. The decker navigator looked down from the bulkhead, beeping as it saw fit and occasionally changing one figure on its screen for another. It didn't matter to me what it changed them to. I knew where I was. Hadn't I just squinted down the log line, spent long minutes watching the compass to gauge an average of our course? Still, it would be interesting to test the accuracy of this box of tricks. The cross it provided, an unusual vertical and horizontal affair, like something out of a maths textbook rather than the normal X of a DR, was some 8 miles to the northeast, and only 5 hours after losing sight of the coast. Thank heavens I was only borrowing the thing. Imagine spending close on £1,000 for something that puts you 8 miles out after only 5 hours. That's almost 1.5 miles of error for every hour. By the time it got us to Falmouth, it would probably think it was in the Skagerrak. It was at this point that Woodgate said something rather disrespectful and possibly mutinous. Perhaps the machine's right and your DR is wrong. Well, hardly likely, was it? Not when you had a skipper so steeped in the law of the sea that his Breton cap, were it possible to prise it off his head, would keep a marine biologist entertained for a week. But the challenge had been made. Honour was at stake. I took the trusty Seafix from its bracket. I waved it in the direction of places such as Portland Bill and the Channel Light Vessel and the Casquettes. Portland Bill was rather a long way away and had to be discounted as unreliable. After all, its bearing went with absurd accuracy right through the middle of the Decker Cross. It was the other two which were more embarrassing. They met in a mocking fix even further to the east. After that, I took to putting the chart away between the hourly plots. Apart from anything else, it left the table clear for ever more detailed calculation of the tides. But all the same, the two lines of crosses stalked off in two very obviously different directions down the channel. The hand-bearing compass and the beam of the Channel Light Vessel joined the Seafix in siding with the Decker. The following day, even the sun agreed with the microchips. Either that or I'd done something unnatural with my transit. It was a rather subdued skipper who sailed into Falmouth, the Decker beeping triumphantly, and Woodgates reminded me that I owed him a pint of St. Austell in the chain locker, something to do with a bet about which I could remember nothing. Mellowed slightly later that night, I did concede that it was convenient to have an accurate fix far from land. Convenient, though hardly important, because the old ways would always get you home in the end. And so we progressed to Ireland and Brittany, and the crosses on the chart changed from X to plus. And I would nod knowledgeably over each one and say things like, "We're making a little more leeway. You can tell by looking at the log line," or "A little more tide this morning. That's to be expected after that blow last night." And the Decker would beep in agreement until I found the chapter in the instruction manual that tells you how to stop it. Apart from anything else, it gave me a chance to say I might get my own one day, when they come down in price, of course. After all, it was nice to have, but hardly essential. In fact, it wasn't until the second half of August that I stopped being rude about the black box on the bulkhead. We had left Descartes Bay on the east coast of Sark early in the morning so as to catch the tide up to Alderney. There was not a breath of wind, but the Channel Islands weather forecast said visibility would improve. It seemed reasonable. Another hot day would soon burn off the mist. Even if it didn't, we could see but the best part of a mile. But it did seem slow in clearing. We left Sark behind us in the murk, with a 3.5 knot tide under us. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, we didn't have mist. We had fog, the thick, clinging kind, full of echoes and shadows of supertankers head-on, the really nasty kind. Also, we were off the southwest corner of Alderney, had only 2 hours of tide left and not an awfully long time to make a decision. We couldn't stay where we were with rocks on all sides and the tide ready to sweep us back to Sark. The sensible thing to do was to get away to the west under the casquettes and come in from the north. But with another full west-going tide to come, that would take 8 hours. 8 hours of swanning about in the fog right on top of the traffic separation screen. So that was how we came to navigate the Swinge without seeing either side. The channel is barely more than half a mile wide, bordered by rocks, and the book says it should not be entered in anything other than reasonable visibility and fair weather. But in we plunged, those vertical crosses carefully skirting the dangers. A liquid crystal pointing the way, left a bit, right a bit. The printed circuit board full of confidence. The first thing we saw was the breakwater at about 30 yards. It never looked so good. It was only later, recounting the tale in the divers, that I happened to mention we'd waited for the tide to ease off and came up slowly and cautiously. How slowly? They asked. A couple of knots? Something like that, I told them. About 1.8 actually. If you'd like to read more from the good stuff, which comes in 2 volumes, you'll find it on the books page of my blog, oldmansailing.com. Goodbye.